Welcome to Chronological Fiction, where real-world events meet the power of storytelling. We're here to breathe new life into history's most interesting moments by turning them into unique narratives. Join our community by subscribing, and let's explore the stories that shaped our world.
The madness of the status quo. Narrator voice, somber, reflective. Pacing, deliberate and heavy. To understand why Reagan's Star Wars was so revolutionary, we must first look at the psychological prison of the 1970s and early 80s. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was the only thing keeping the peace. It was a suicide pact on a global scale. Imagine a world where thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, are sitting in silos, waiting for a signal. Once launched, there was no stopping them. An ICBM could travel from the Soviet Union to Washington, D.C. in less than 30 minutes. If the radar screens showed a launch, the American president had roughly 15 minutes to decide whether to end human civilization in response. The morality of defense, Ronald Reagan hated this. To him, it was morally bankrupt. He was a man who believed in heroes, in shields, and in clear-cut victories of good over evil. He found the idea of peace through terror to be an American failure. But the Soviets were winning the numbers game. By the early 80s, the USSR had a massive lead in heavy ICBMs. They had the SS-18 Satan, a missile so large and powerful it could carry 10 independent nuclear warheads. American strategists feared a window of vulnerability, a moment where the Soviets could launch a first strike and wipe out the US ability to retaliate. The world was stuck in a loop of escalation. More warheads, more accuracy, more terror. The Star Wars project wasn't just a military plan, it was Reagan's attempt to flip the board over and play a different game entirely. He wanted to turn the Cold War from a contest of who has the most bombs into a contest of who has the best computers. And he knew that in that game, the Soviets were already losing. Chapter 2. Enter the SDI, the tech of tomorrow. Narrator voice, energetic, slightly cinematic, emphasizing the wonder of science. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was a multi-layered shield. The idea was to hit a bullet with a bullet in the vacuum of space. But Reagan's vision went far beyond simple interceptor missiles. He wanted a layered defense that would attack Soviet missiles in 4 distinct phases. 1. The boost phase. The moment the Soviet missiles left their silos, massive orbital sensors would detect the heat of their engines. Immediately, space-based lasers would fire. The concept included chemical lasers and X-ray lasers. One of the more exotic proposals involved a nuclear explosion in space that would channel its energy into a forest of laser rods, firing beams across thousands of miles to melt the skin of the Soviet missiles before they even left the atmosphere. 2. The mid-course phase. If the missiles survived the initial lasers, they would enter the mid-course phase, drifting through the silence of space. Here, the SDI would deploy brilliant pebbles. These were thousands of small, autonomous kinetic satellites. They didn't carry explosives, they were simply smart rocks made of tungsten. They would maneuver themselves into the path of the incoming warheads, using pure kinetic energy to shatter them at speeds of 15,000 miles per hour. 3. The re-entry phase. Finally, if any warheads made it through the laser fire and the clouds of tungsten pebbles, ground-based railguns and high-speed interceptors would meet them in the upper atmosphere. The scientific backlash. The American scientific community was in an uproar. Men like Carl Sagan and Hans Bethe argued that the Star Wars shield could be defeated by simple countermeasures. The Soviets could just paint their missiles with reflective surfaces or launch thousands of decoys, balloons that looked like warheads to fool the sensors. They argued that for the shield to work, it had to be 100% perfect. If 10,000 warheads were launched and the shield was 99% effective, 100 nukes would still get through. And 100 nukes were more than enough to end the United States. But Reagan didn't care about 100% perfection. He cared about uncertainty. If the Soviets weren't sure their missiles would land, they wouldn't launch them. The shield didn't have to be a wall, it just had to be a doubt. Chapter 3. The Kremlin shudders. The fear of a space Pearl Harbor. Narrator voice, dark, tense, echoing the cold hallways of the Kremlin. Pacing, very slow. When Reagan delivered his SDI speech, the reaction in Moscow was not one of mockery, but of pure, unadulterated panic. The Soviet leadership, led by the aging and ailing Yuri Andropov, didn't see a peace shield. They saw a space Pearl Harbor. To the Soviet generals, the math was terrifying. If the United States possessed a shield that could stop 95% or 99% of a retaliatory strike, it meant the US could launch a first strike with impunity. In their minds, SDI was the final piece of an offensive puzzle. Once the shield was up, the Americans could erase the Soviet Union from the map, and the Soviets would be unable to punch back. The computer gap, but there was a deeper, more fundamental fear: the silicon gap. By 1983, the Soviets knew they were losing the technological race. While American teenagers were playing video games and offices were being revolutionized by the first Macintosh and IBM PCs, Soviet computers were still massive, unreliable machines based on stolen 1970s Western technology. The SDI required parallel processing and real-time tracking that was decades ahead of anything the KGB could steal. The Kremlin realized that if the Cold War became a war of software, they had already lost. They viewed SDI as a technological Berlin Wall in the sky, a barrier they could never climb over. This psychological weight began to crush the spirit of the Soviet High Command before a single laser was even built. Chapter 4: The Art of the Bluff, Projects Excalibur and the Great Leak. Narrator voice: gritty, investigative, like a spy novel. Pacing: moderate with dramatic swells. Was SDI real? This is the $200 billion question. To keep the Soviet Union in a state of panic, the Reagan administration engaged in one of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns in history. The Excalibur illusion. At the heart of the bluff was Project Excalibur. Led by the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, this project aimed to create an X-ray laser powered by a nuclear explosion. In theory, a single nuclear blast in space could power dozens of laser beams. In reality, the tests were failures. The sensors were often calibrated to show success where there was none. But the leaks to the press, and subsequently to the KGB, told a different story. American intelligence ensured that Soviet spies found classified documents suggesting that the X-ray laser was not only possible but nearly ready for deployment. The paint trick. During one famous test of a ground-based laser hitting a target in space, the success was a total fabrication. The target had been coated in highly reflective, chemically sensitive paint to ensure it would shatter when hit by even a weak beam. To a Soviet observer watching from a distance, it looked like the US had a Death Star beam. In reality, it was a flashlight hitting a glass ornament. Reagan himself may have believed it was all possible. He was an optimist by nature. But his brain trust knew that even if the tech was 50 years away, the threat of the tech was useful today. They were selling a future that the Soviets felt forced to buy at an impossible price. Chapter 5: Reykjavik, the poker game of the century. Narrator voice: intense, focused, emphasizing the high stakes of diplomacy. In October 1986, Ronald Reagan and the new, energetic Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in a small white house in Reykjavik, Iceland. This was the moment the bluff was pushed to the center of the table. Gorbachev was desperate. He knew the Soviet economy was hemorrhaging money. He offered Reagan the deal of a lifetime: the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. It was the dream of the 20th century. But there was one condition. Reagan had to give up SDI. He had to confine it to the laboratory. The walkout, the room was silent. Reagan's advisors held their breath. Reagan looked at Gorbachev and refused. He would not give up the shield. He called it the insurance policy for a nuclear-free world. The summit collapsed. Reagan walked out. To the world, it looked like a failure. But to the Kremlin, it was the final proof. They reasoned that if Reagan was willing to walk away from the greatest peace deal in history just to keep Star Wars, then the technology must be real. The bluff had worked. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, convinced that he could not outspend or outthink the Americans in space. He had to find a different way out. Chapter 6: The Economic Guillotine. Bankruptcy of a superpower. Narrator voice: somber, analytical, building toward the collapse. To compete with SDI, the Soviet Union launched its own response: Project Polyus. They attempted to launch a massive orbital laser platform. On May 15, 1987, the Polyus was launched atop the massive Energia rocket. It was a desperate, multi-billion ruble gamble. The launch failed. The Polyus crashed into the Pacific Ocean. It was the symbolic end of the Soviet space empire. Bread versus beams. By the late 80s, the USSR was spending nearly 25% of its GDP on defense. For comparison, the US was spending about 6%. Soviet citizens were standing in lines for hours just to buy a loaf of bread, while their government was pouring billions into space lasers that didn't work. Gorbachev realized he couldn't maintain the empire and compete with Reagan's Star Wars fantasies. He chose to save his country by ending the confrontation. SDI had forced the Soviet Union to confront its own obsolescence. The space weapon didn't need to fire a single shot to destroy the Soviet system. It simply had to exist as an expensive, unreachable goal. Conclusion: the shield of the mind. Narrator voice, reflective, fading into a triumphant but thoughtful finish. The Cold War ended not with a nuclear mushroom cloud, but with the fall of a wall in Berlin. When historians look back at why the Soviet Union folded so quickly, the Strategic Defense Initiative stands as the primary catalyst. Was it a bluff? Mostly. Even today, 40 years later, we still don't have a 100% effective missile shield. But in the world of geopolitics, perception is reality. Ronald Reagan understood that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger that functioned on fear. By introducing a shield they couldn't penetrate, he took away their only weapon, the threat of destruction. The Star Wars project taught us that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal isn't a laser or a bomb. It is the imagination of the enemy. Chapter 7. The Hollywood President and the Cinematic Shield. Narrator voice, nostalgic, storytelling, slightly whimsical but grounded. Pacing, very slow. To understand SDI, one must understand the man who dreamed it. Ronald Reagan was not a nuclear physicist. He was not a career general. He was an actor. He understood the power of a story, and he understood that the American people needed a hero narrative to counter the villain narrative of the Soviet Union. The movie influence. In 1940, Reagan starred in a film called Murder in the Air, playing a secret agent protecting a death ray weapon that could shoot down enemy planes. Decades later, as president, he saw a demonstration of a laser and reportedly asked, "Can we really do this?" Critics mocked him. They said he couldn't distinguish between a film set and the Pentagon. But Reagan's cinematic view of the world was his greatest strength. He knew that if he could convince the world that America was building a force field, the cold reality of physics wouldn't matter as much as the hot fear in the Kremlin. For the audiobook, imagine the sound of a film projector clicking in the background, the flickering light of a dream becoming the policy of a superpower. Chapter 8. Polyus, the Soviet Death Star that fell. Narrator voice, dark, industrial, focusing on the failure of a giant. Pacing, measured. While the Americans were bluffing with lasers and brilliant pebbles, the Soviets were desperately trying to build something real. This was Project Skiff, and its crowning achievement was the Polyus. The Polyus was a 100-ton orbital battle station. It was painted jet black to avoid detection and was designed to house a massive carbon dioxide laser capable of blinding American satellites. It was the Soviet Union's last, greatest gasp in the space race. The launch of May 1987, the Polyus was launched atop the Energia, the most powerful rocket the Soviets had ever built. But the Soviet system was crumbling. In a tragic comic error of engineering, the satellite's internal guidance system was programmed incorrectly. After separating from the rocket, the Polyus was supposed to flip 180 degrees to fire its engines. Instead, it flipped 360 degrees. It fired its engines and drove itself directly into the Pacific Ocean. Billions of rubles, money that could have been used to buy grain for the starving Soviet populace, sank to the bottom of the sea. It was the physical manifestation of the Soviet collapse. They had tried to meet Reagan's Star Wars with their own Death Star, and they had failed. Chapter 9. Operation Ryan, on the brink of the end. Narrator voice, tense, urgent, fast-paced, pacing, quick, but breathless. The year was 1983. the year of the SDI speech. To the Soviets, the combination of Reagan's evil empire rhetoric and the Star Wars project suggested that a nuclear-first strike was imminent. They launched Operation Ryan, Vreketnoye Yadanoye Napadani. This was the largest peacetime intelligence-gathering operation in Soviet history. Every KGB agent in the West was ordered to look for indicators of a US attack. Were lights on late at the Pentagon? Were more blood donors being called to hospitals? Was the president moving to a bunker? Archer 83. The paranoia peaked during a NATO exercise called Able Archer 83. The Soviets misinterpreted the drill for a real countdown. They fueled their missiles. They put their bombers on alert. The world was closer to total annihilation in 1983 than it had been during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Reagan later learned how close he had pushed the Soviets to the edge with his Star Wars rhetoric, he was horrified. This realization led to the softening of his stance and the eventual summits with Gorbachev. The Star Wars project wasn't just a bluff to win, it was a gamble that almost lost everything. Chapter 10. From Star Wars to Iron Dome, The Long Shadow. Narrator voice, reflective, modern, looking toward the future. Pacing, slow. The Cold War ended, but the Star Wars project didn't die. It simply changed its name. In the 1990s, it became the BMDO, Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. In the 2000s, it evolved into the systems we see today. THAAD, Aegis, and the GMD, Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense. The modern shield, Reagan's dream of a total shield, remains technically impossible today. However, the tactical shield is a reality. Israel's Iron Dome and the Arrow system are the direct descendants of the research funded by Reagan's billions in the 1980s. Was the $200 billion bluff worth it? Technologically, it accelerated the development of microchips, sensors, and satellite communication by decades. Politically, it ended the 40-year nuclear stalemate without a shot fired. Economically, it was the final nail in the coffin of a bankrupt Soviet ideology. Epilogue, the victory of imagination. Narrator voice, soft, fading, triumphant but solemn. As the 2-hour mark approaches, we are left with a single, profound lesson. The Cold War was a war of the mind. It was won not by the man with the most bullets, but by the man who could paint the most convincing picture of the future. The Star Wars project was a masterpiece of geopolitical theater. It utilized the most American of traits, optimism, technical ingenuity, and a touch of Hollywood magic, to defeat a system that functioned on fear and rigidity. The lasers may never have fired, and the brilliant pebbles may still be in boxes in a laboratory, but the peace they bought is the world we live in today. Chapter 11. The Young Turks of Livermore. The cult of the X-ray laser, narrator voice, intellectual, intense, focusing on the mad scientist archetype. Pacing, slow, almost reverent. Behind the political speeches and the billion-dollar budgets sat a group of men who lived in a windowless world. These were the Young Turks of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. To reach our 2-hour target, we must spend time in their world, a world of caffeine-fueled all-nighters, classified physics, and a singular burning obsession, the X-ray laser. At the center of this group was Peter Hagelstein, a brilliant 20-something scientist who was more interested in curing cancer with lasers than fighting wars. Yet in the pressure cooker environment of the Cold War, his work was weaponized. The Young Turks weren't old guard generals, they were hackers of the physical world. They believed they could code the laws of physics to create a beam that could travel thousands of miles through the vacuum of space. The O Group, they called themselves the O Group. They operated with a cult-like intensity, working 80-hour weeks under the shadow of the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller. To these men, SDI wasn't a bluff, it was a puzzle. They weren't trying to win a war, they were trying to solve an equation. For the audiobook listener, imagine the sound of chalk on a chalkboard, the hum of mainframe computers, and the absolute silence of a high-security bunker. These men were the architects of the dream. If the project was a bluff, no one told the men in Livermore. They were building the future, one photon at a time, unaware that their failures were being packaged as successes to scare the Kremlin. Chapter 12. The Iron Lady's Skepticism. Thatcher and the SDI Friction. Narrator voice, stern, British accented influence, focusing on the old world versus new world. While Reagan was dreaming of a space shield, his closest ally, Margaret Thatcher, was privately horrified. The Iron Lady was a chemist by training. She understood the science, and more importantly, she understood the delicate balance of European security. The Fortress America. Thatcher feared that if the United States built a shield, it would retreat into Fortress America. If the US was safe behind a wall of lasers, would they still care if Soviet tanks rolled into West Berlin or London? She worried that SDI would decouple American security from European security. To make this section fill the time, we must listen to the secret transcripts of their meetings. Thatcher would lecture Reagan for hours on the technical impossibility of the project. Reagan, in his charming Californian way, would simply smile and say, "But Margaret, wouldn't it be better to save lives than to avenge them?" This friction nearly fractured NATO. It forced the US to offer SDI contracts to British and German companies, essentially buying their political support with research grants. It was a massive transfer of wealth and technology designed to keep the alliance together while the Americans chased a phantom in the stars. Chapter 13. The Brilliant Pebbles. The Physics of a Smart Rock. Narrator voice, clinical, technical, focusing on the power of small things. By the mid-1980s, the grand lasers were failing. They were too big, too expensive, and too easy to break. Enter Lowell Wood and his concept of brilliant pebbles. This is where the SDI shifted from science fiction to modern warfare. The concept, instead of one giant laser, why not launch 4,000 tiny satellites? Each pebble would be the size of a cereal box, equipped with its own camera, its own computer, and its own rocket engine. They wouldn't fire beams, they would simply crash into the Soviet missiles. The math of kinetic kill, speed, 15,000 miles per hour. Mass, 10 kilograms, energy, it is frac 1. At those speeds, a pebble doesn't need an explosive. The impact energy is greater than its weight in TNT. It is a smart rock, thrown with the force of a cosmic god. Image, a conceptual drawing of a brilliant pebble interceptor satellite in Earth orbit. The narrator should spend 10 minutes describing the autonomous nature of these pebbles. They were the ancestors of today's swarm drones. They were designed to talk to each other without human intervention. To the Soviets, the idea of 4,000 autonomous assassin satellites orbiting the Earth was even more terrifying than a laser. It meant the sky was no longer a vacuum. It was a minefield. Chapter 14. The Spy in the Silo. Intelligence and counterintelligence. Narrator voice, whispering, shadowy, focusing on the game of mirrors. How did the Soviets know about SDI? Because the Americans wanted them to know, but only the right things. This was the era of the double-blind intelligence war. The FBI and CIA began a campaign of strategic leaks. They allowed Soviet agents to steal blueprints that were 90% accurate but contained 10% fatal flaws. They wanted the Soviets to spend billions of rubles chasing dead-end technologies. The case of the modified chip, one legendary story, often debated but deeply influential, tells of the CIA allowing the Soviets to steal software designed to control gas pipelines. The software worked perfectly for months, until a Trojan horse inside the code caused the pumps to overpressurize, leading to one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever seen from space. In the context of SDI, the US leaked advancements in mirror-pointing technology. The Soviets, desperate to keep up, redirected their best scientists to copy these advancements, only to find out years later that the math was intentionally skewed. The Star Wars project wasn't just a military program, it was a psychological operation designed to turn the Soviet Union's own intelligence apparatus against itself. Chapter 15. The Zion of Science. The Secret Cities of the USSR. Narrator voice, cold, bleak, focusing on the closed cities. To understand the Soviet response, we must travel to Sari Shagan and Semipalatinsk. These were closed cities, places that didn't exist on any Soviet map. Here, thousands of scientists lived in a state of high-altitude exile, trying to build a counter-SDI. The Terra 3 project, the Soviets had their own laser program, called Terra 3. It was located on the shores of Lake Balkhash. It was a massive complex, powered by its own dedicated nuclear power plant. While the Americans were talking about brilliant pebbles, the Soviets were building massive ground-based laser cannons to shoot down American shuttles. Image: the ruins of the Terra 3 laser testing site in present-day Kazakhstan. The tragedy of the Soviet scientists was that they were working with 1960s hardware to solve 1980s problems. They were brilliant men trapped in a broken system. For the audiobook, describe the winter at Sari Shagan, the frozen equipment, the lack of food, and the desperate pressure from Moscow to produce a miracle that would stop Reagan's lasers. This human cost, the scientific gulag, is the true unspoken price of the Star Wars bluff. Chapter 16. The Space Shuttle, the ultimate Trojan horse, narrator voice, cinematic, slightly mysterious, focusing on the dual-use nature of NASA's icon. Pacing, measured and slow. In the public eye, the Space Shuttle was a symbol of peaceful exploration, a winged messenger carrying scientists and satellites, but in the eyes of the Kremlin, the shuttle was the most dangerous weapon in Reagan's arsenal. To them, the shuttle wasn't a cargo ship, it was a space bomber. The diving maneuver, panic Soviet analysts were obsessed with the shuttle's cross-range capability, its ability to glide hundreds of miles to the side of its orbit. They feared a single orbit strike. They imagined the shuttle launching from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, flying over the North Pole, dropping a nuclear payload on Moscow, and gliding back to Earth before the Soviet radars could even confirm the launch. The secret manifests many shuttle missions in the 1980s were classified. The astronauts were military officers. The cargo was Department of Defense secret. During these missions, the shuttle was testing the pointing and tracking mechanisms for SDI. Imagine the scene: the shuttle cargo bay doors open in the dead of night over the Pacific. An experimental sensor, codenamed Delta 180, is deployed. It tracks a mock missile launch with a precision that was previously thought impossible. The Soviets watched these missions via their own spy satellites, their screens filled with the grainy image of the American shuttle behaving like a predator in the dark. This weaponization of NASA was the ultimate psychological lever. It forced the Soviets to spend billions on their own shuttle, the Buran, a move that ultimately helped bankrupt their space program. Chapter 17. Starfish Prime and the EMP Ghost. Narrator voice, clinical, echoing, focusing on the unseen energy of the Cold War. Pacing, very slow. To reach our 2-hour mark, we must dive into the physics of the invisible hammer. Before the SDI, the US and USSR had experimented with high-altitude nuclear explosions. The most famous was Starfish Prime in 1962. When a 1.4 megaton bomb was detonated 250 miles above the Pacific, it didn't just create a glow, it knocked out streetlights in Hawaii and crippled satellites. The physics of the pulse, the SDI scientists were obsessed with the electromagnetic pulse, EMP. If the Soviets launched 1,000 missiles, a single US defensive nuclear burst in space could create a Compton effect, stripping electrons from the upper atmosphere and creating a massive surge of energy. The electric field strength E dollars of such a pulse can be modeled by the simplified relationship R ET equals EC0 EL das beta TC EE alpha, where E0 is the peak field strength and Kirigit alpha thwaras and plushes beta TEs are the rise and fall constants of the pulse. In the 1980s, the SDI project aimed to create hardened electronics that could survive a field of 50,000 volts per meter. The narrator should spend 10 minutes describing the EMP apocalypse scenario. Imagine a world where the Star Wars shield works, but the resulting pulse fries every computer, every car, and every power grid on the continent. This was the dark side of the shield, the realization that even a perfect defense might leave the survivors living in the 18th century. Chapter 18. Project Eureka, the European counter-move. Narrator voice, proud, continental, focusing on the French and German response. While the Americans were looking at the stars, the Europeans were looking at their own industries. French President François Mitterrand was terrified that the SDI would cause a brain drain, sucking all of Europe's best scientists to California. The civilian shield in 1985, Europe launched Project Eureka. It was designed to be the non-military Star Wars. It focused on lasers, high-speed computers, and new materials, but for civilian use. It was a fascinating moment of geopolitical friction. The US wanted Europe to help build the shield. Europe wanted to build the computers that would power the 21st century without the Pentagon's oversight. This competition accelerated the tech race even further. For every billion Reagan spent on a space laser, Mitterrand and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl spent millions on high-definition television and robotics. The 1980s became a global tournament of engineering. To the listener, this period should feel like a gold rush, where the prize wasn't gold, but the information age itself. Chapter 19. The God Eye. The birth of modern surveillance. Narrator voice, whispering, omnipresent, focusing on the end of secrets. The Star Wars project required a level of surveillance that defied belief. It gave birth to the KH-11 Kennen and later the KH-12 satellites. These were the first real-time eyes in the sky. The death of the secret before the SDI, satellite film had to be dropped in canisters and caught by planes in mid-air. With the SDI funding, the US perfected digital imaging and satellite-to-satellite relay. Suddenly, a general in the Pentagon could see a Soviet soldier smoking a cigarette on a launch pad in Siberia. In near real-time, image, a high-resolution 1980s satellite photo of a Soviet shipyard. Showcasing the detail of the KH-11, the narrator should spend 15 minutes discussing the psychological impact of being watched. For the Soviet leadership, this was the end of their strategic depth. They could no longer hide their movements. The SDI God Eye turned the entire Soviet Union into a glass house. This transparency didn't just help the military, it forced the Soviet government to be more honest with their own people, eventually leading to glasnost, openness. The shield wasn't just made of lasers, it was made of light, the light of cameras that saw everything. Chapter 20. The Brilliant Descendants, GPS and the Invisible Map, narrator voice, reflective, modern, connecting the past to the present. As we head toward the final chapters of our 2-hour journey, we must look at the device in your pocket. The Global Positioning System, GPS, was a direct beneficiary of the SDI's massive appetite for precision. To hit a Soviet missile in space, you had to know exactly where you were within centimeters. The network of satellites we use today to find a coffee shop was originally designed to guide brilliant pebbles to their targets. The irony of history. The technology designed to facilitate the most complex war in history became the foundation of the most peaceful global infrastructure ever built. The Star Wars project didn't end in space. It ended in the palm of your hand. For the audiobook, describe the contrast between a Star Wars scientist in 1984 and a teenager today using the same satellite network to play an augmented reality game. The bluff may have ended the Cold War, but the science created the modern world. Chapter 21. The Dear Mikhail Letters, Diplomacy in the Shadow of Lasers, narrator voice, intimate, personal, focusing on the human connection, pacing, very slow and reflective. While the generals at the Pentagon were drawing up plans for orbital battle stations, Ronald Reagan was doing something far more traditional. He was writing letters. To understand the Star Wars bluff, we must read the private correspondence between Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. These were not the cold, formal cables of the 1970s. These were long, often handwritten letters where Reagan tried to explain his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. Reagan would write about his hope for a shield that he would, incredibly, share with the Soviet Union. The sharing promise, Reagan repeatedly promised that once the SDI was perfected, the US would give the technology to Moscow so that everyone would be safe. Gorbachev never believed him. In the Soviet mindset, no superpower gives away its greatest advantage. Gorbachev viewed this promise as a sophisticated psychological trick, a way to make the Soviets feel protected, while the Americans actually prepared for a strike. The narrator should spend 15 minutes reading excerpts from these letters. Imagine the scene: Gorbachev in the Kremlin, surrounded by hardline Marxists, reading a letter from a cowboy president who talks about sharing space lasers. The clash of worldviews was total. This personal friction created a trust gap that SDI filled with fear, forcing Gorbachev to realize that the only way to survive Reagan was to change the Soviet Union entirely. Chapter 22. Project Senior Trend, the stealth shadow, narrator voice, gritty, technical, focusing on the invisible threat. Pacing, measured. While the public was looking at the Star Wars in the sky, a much more grounded and real technology was being perfected in the deserts of Nevada. This was the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first stealth fighter. To the Soviets, the F-117 was the grounded version of SDI. If the SDI could stop their missiles from going up, the stealth fighter could prevent their radars from seeing American bombs coming down. The radar cross-section, RCS. The physics of stealth was as revolutionary as the physics of lasers. By using faceted surfaces, the F-117 reduced its radar return to the size of a marble. The mathematical challenge was calculating the reflection of electromagnetic waves from complex 3D surfaces. This involved the Maxwell equations, particularly the behavior of waves at boundaries. Manos oint lasarsi, bash math bee, mas c.h, d math psal, e frac d dati int, us, yas math babas psal c dot d math bavos. The Soviets had actually pioneered the math behind stealth in the 1960s, but they lacked the computers to apply it to an airplane. When the US debuted the F-117 during the 1980s, it sent a message: "We have mastered the mathematics of invisibility." The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the secret flight of the F-117 over the Nevada test ranges. The Soviets were monitoring these flights, seeing ghosts on their radar that appeared and disappeared. In their minds, the US was building a dual-threat system: a shield in space and an invisible sword in the air. The combined cost of countering both was a number the Soviet economy simply could not produce. Chapter 23. The Body Language of Geneva. The First Meeting. Narrator voice. Observational, focusing on the theater of politics. Pacing, moderate. November 1985. Geneva, Switzerland. The first time Reagan and Gorbachev met face-to-face. To reach our 2-hour mark, we must dissect the theatricality of this meeting. The most famous moment wasn't in the meeting room. It was by the fireplace in a small boathouse. Reagan, the veteran actor, knew exactly how to set the scene. He wore no overcoat in the cold air, looking strong and youthful next to the bundled-up Gorbachev. The fireplace chat, inside by the fire, they spoke without advisors. This is where Reagan pushed the SDI hardest. He looked Gorbachev in the eye and said, "I want to make nuclear weapons obsolete." Gorbachev responded with a list of technical objections, but he was visibly rattled by Reagan's conviction. The narrator should describe the body language of the two men. Reagan's relaxed, confident posture contrasted with Gorbachev's intense, rapid-fire speech. To the Soviet leader, Reagan didn't look like a man who was bluffing. He looked like a man who truly believed he had the hand of God in his pocket. This meeting was the moment Gorbachev realized he wasn't fighting a military-industrial complex. He was fighting a visionary. Chapter 24. The Disappearing Billions. The paper trail of SDI narrator voice, investigative, follow the money. Pacing, steady. Between 1983 and 1989, the US government spent nearly $30 billion on SDI research. In today's money, that is closer to $100 billion. Where did that money go? To reach our 2-hour target, the narrator should read A Audit of the Stars, $2 billion on the Airborne Optical Observatory, $1.5 billion on the Mid-Course Experiment, MSX, satellite, hundreds of millions on railgun research at the University of Texas. The black budget. A significant portion of this money disappeared into black projects. To the Soviets, this was the most frightening part. They could see the public SDI budget, but they knew the real work was happening in secret. They assumed the Americans were 10 years ahead of what they were actually saying. In reality, much of the money was spent on fundamental research that had nothing to do with shooting down missiles. It was spent on high-performance computing, gallium arsenide microchips, and infrared sensors. The Star Wars project was essentially a massive government subsidy for the American tech industry. While the Soviet Union was building more tanks, the US was building the foundations of the internet and the modern digital economy. The bluff wasn't just about weapons, it was about financing the future while the enemy was stuck in the past. Chapter 25. The 1991 Coup, The Final Panic. Narrator voice, tense, historical, focusing on the end game. Pacing, fast then slow. As the Soviet Union began to fracture in 1991, the hardliners in the KGB and the military launched a coup against Gorbachev. Their primary grievance? That Gorbachev had sold out the Soviet military to the Americans. The shield as a trigger, the hardliners believed that if they could seize power, they could restart the arms race and finally defeat the SDI. But they were too late. The Soviet soldiers on the streets of Moscow were no longer interested in fighting for a space shield, while they had no food in their kitchens. When the coup failed, the Star Wars project achieved its final quiet victory. It had exhausted the Soviet system to the point of structural failure. The space weapon didn't need to fire a single laser beam to win. It simply had to outlive the political will of its opponent. Image: a Russian tank in front of the Bolshoi Theater during the August 1991 coup attempt. Chapter 26, The Buran, the Mirror That Cracked. Narrator voice, melancholic, slightly ironic, focusing on the copycat syndrome. Pacing, slow and steady. While the American space shuttle was the star of the SDI show, the Soviet Union was building its own version, the Buran. It was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering, but its existence was born entirely out of fear. The Kremlin was so convinced that the American shuttle was a weapon that they ordered their engineers to build a carbon copy, regardless of the cost. The $20 billion mirror, the Buran, looked so much like the space shuttle that NASA engineers joked about checking their blueprints for copyright infringement. However, beneath the surface, it was a very different machine. It had no main engines on the orbiter. Instead, it relied on the massive Energia rocket. On November 15, 1988, the Buran made its first and only flight. It was a triumph, completely automated, landing in a crosswind with a precision that the American shuttle couldn't match. But there was no money left. The Soviet Union was a house of cards, and the Buran was the heaviest card of all. After one flight, the program was mothballed. The hangars at Baikonur became tomb-like. In 2002, the roof of the main hangar collapsed, crushing the only Buran that had ever flown. It was the physical end of the Soviet attempt to match Reagan's Star Wars. They had spent billions to build a mirror, only for the mirror to shatter before they could even use it to look at the stars. Chapter 27. Kwajalein, the Pacific Proving Grounds. Narrator voice. Deep, echoing, focusing on the secret island. Pacing, very slow. To find the physical heart of the SDI project, you have to travel to a tiny speck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the Kwajalein Atoll. This was the stage where the Star Wars actors practiced their most dangerous stunts. Hitting a bullet with a bullet, June 1984, the US conducted the HOE, homing overlay experiment. An interceptor was launched from Kwajalein to hit a dummy warhead launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base, 4,000 miles away. This wasn't a laser, it was a kinetic kill. To reach the 2-hour mark, the narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the physics of this interception. In the vacuum of space, the relative speeds are staggering. To calculate the intercept, the onboard computer had to solve for the orbital velocity v fidulas of the target. Arrivavise SQRTRs frac GM trasar, where G dals is the gravitational constant, m dals is the mass of the Earth, and $dollars is the distance from the Earth's center. Imagine the interceptor deploying a weighted net, an umbrella made of steel, just seconds before impact. When the two objects met, they weren't exploding, they were simply ceasing to exist as solid objects. The kinetic energy was so high that they turned into a cloud of plasma. The success of this test was broadcast to the world, but years later it was revealed that the test had been rigged. With an onboard beacon, to help the interceptor find its target. Another brick in the wall of the Great Bluff. Chapter 28, The Transition, from Star Wars to Missile Defense, narrator voice, analytical, transitioning from the 80s to the 90s. Pacing, moderate. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December 1991, the Star Wars project lost its primary antagonist, but the money and the research didn't stop, they simply went underground. President Bill Clinton renamed the program the BMDO, Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. The rogue state shift, the narrative shifted from the evil empire to rogue states. The threat was no longer 10,000 Soviet warheads, but a single missile from North Korea or Iran. The SDI technology was scaled down. Instead of giant space lasers, the military focused on theater missile defense. The narrator should spend 15 minutes discussing the Patriot missile during the First Gulf War in 1991. This was the first time the public saw Star Wars technology in action. Even though the Patriot's success rate against Iraqi Scuds was later debated, the image of a missile intercepting another missile on live television solidified the belief that the shield was real. The bluff had transitioned from a strategic tool to a tactical reality. The seeds planted by Reagan's billions were starting to sprout in the sands of Kuwait. Chapter 29, The Modern Horizon, Hypersonics and AI narrator. Voice, futuristic, urgent, slightly ominous. Pacing, slow. As we move into the 21st century, the ghost of SDI has returned with a vengeance. We are now in the era of hypersonic glide vehicles, HGVs. These are missiles that travel at Mach 5 or faster, skipping along the edge of the atmosphere like a stone on water. The new arms race. Russia and China are now building the weapons that Reagan's shield was designed to stop. In response, the US has revived the Star Wars spirit with Space Force. We are seeing the return of directed energy weapons, lasers, and space-based sensors. The math has become even more complex. Tracking a hypersonic target requires AI-driven predictive modeling of fluid dynamics at high temperatures. The bluff of 1983 has become the requirement of 2026. The full circle. The 2-hour audiobook should conclude this section by noting that we are once again living in a world of shields and swords. The only difference is that the pebbles are now smarter, the lasers are actually becoming real, and the bluff has been replaced by an automated algorithmic arms race. We didn't end the Cold War, we just upgraded the software. Chapter 30, The Hotline and the Red Telephone. Crisis Management in the Age of Lasers. Narrator voice, tense, historical, focusing on the high-stakes communication. Pacing. Very slow and rhythmic. While the public was dazzled by the vision of space lasers, the real shield was often a simple telephone line. The Washington-Moscow Direct Communications Link, famously known as the Red Telephone, was the most vital piece of technology during the SDI era. To reach our 2-hour goal, we must spend time in the link room, where translators and technicians sat 24/7 waiting for the words that would mean the end of the world. During the height of the Star Wars friction, this line wasn't just for emergencies, it was for transparency. Reagan used it to reassure Gorbachev that the SDI was defensive, while the Soviet leader used it to warn that Moscow would not be intimidated. The protocol of silence. Imagine the psychological weight on the operators. They were the ones who saw the pulse of the Cold War. In 1983, during the Able Archer crisis, the line went terrifyingly quiet. The silence was as dangerous as a launch. The Star Wars project made these communications even more complex. How do you explain a test of a space-based sensor without the other side thinking you are preparing a strike? The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the technical evolution of the hotline. It wasn't actually a red phone. It was a series of teletype machines and later high-speed facsimile links. The transition from paper to digital, mirror-imaged, the transition from mutual destruction to mutual defense. This chapter should feel like a ticking clock, the sounds of the printer, the hum of the cooling fans, and the heavy silence of the men waiting for the next message. Chapter 31, The X-37B, the modern phantom of the SDI. Narrator voice, shadowy, investigative, focusing on the current secret, pacing, measured and slightly faster. The Cold War ended, but the Star Wars didn't stop. It just became quieter. Today, the most direct descendant of Reagan's dream is the Boeing X-37B, the US Space Force's secret robotic space plane. To the world, the X-37B is a mystery. It launches atop a conventional rocket, stays in orbit for years at a time, the current record is 908 days, and then glides back to Earth to land autonomously. What is it doing up there? The Swiss Army knife of space military analysts believe the X-37B is the physical embodiment of the layered defense envisioned in 1983. It is a testing platform for next-generation infrared sensors, small maneuvering satellites, the modern brilliant pebbles, directed energy weapons, lasers. The narrator should spend 20 minutes discussing the orbital mechanics of the X-37B. Unlike a normal satellite, it can change its orbit frequently, making it impossible for Russia or China to track reliably. This unpredictability is the ultimate evolution of the Star Wars bluff. The bluff has moved from a speech in the Oval Office to an invisible object in orbit. As long as the enemy doesn't know what the X-37B can do, they must assume it can do everything. Chapter 32, The Moral Paradox, The Ethics of a Billion-Dollar Lie. Narrator voice, philosophical, somber, inquisitive. Pacing, very slow. As we reach the final chapters, we must ask the most difficult question of all. Is it ethical to lie for peace? The Strategic Defense Initiative was, for all intents and purposes, a massive deception. The technology didn't work. The lasers were weak. The smart rocks couldn't hit their targets. Yet, this deception saved millions of lives by ending a 40-year nuclear stalemate. The Machiavellian shield. If Reagan had been honest, if he had told the Soviets, "We're trying to build a shield, but it's failing," the Cold War might have lasted another 20 years, or ended in a desperate Soviet invasion of Europe. By selling a future that didn't exist, Reagan forced the Soviets to accept a peace that did. The narrator should engage in a 15-minute philosophical debate. Was the $200 billion better spent on a bluff than on 5,000 more real nuclear warheads? Does the end, the fall of the Berlin Wall, justify the means, the systematic deception of the global public and the scientific community? This is the ghost of the Star Wars project. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a victory of perception over reality. Chapter 33, The Final Verdict, The Shield of Shadows. Narrator voice, grand, epic, concluding, fading into silence. Pacing, extremely slow. The year is 1989, the wall falls. The year is 1991. The Soviet flag is lowered for the last time. As we look back through the lens of history, we see that the Star Wars project achieved exactly what it set out to do, but not in the way anyone expected. It didn't shoot down a single missile, it didn't win a single space battle, but it won the war of the mind. The last word, Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, was the ultimate American story. A mixture of high technology, Hollywood showmanship, and a stubborn, unshakable optimism. It proved that in the 20th century, the greatest weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a microchip. The Cold War ended because one side realized it could no longer calculate the future as fast as the other. The space weapon was never meant to be a weapon of fire. It was a weapon of obsolescence. Chapter 34, The Cyber Genesis, SDI and the Birth of the Digital Battlefield. Narrator voice, analytical, visionary, focusing on the invisible side of the project. Pacing, very slow and instructional. While the public was mesmerized by the idea of physical lasers, the true breakthrough of the Strategic Defense Initiative was in distributed computing. To shoot down 1,000 warheads simultaneously, the US needed a network that could process data at a speed previously unimaginable. This was the dawn of the digital battlefield. The SDI required a battle management software that was millions of lines of code long. At the time, skeptics said it was impossible, that a single software bug could lead to a nuclear catastrophe. This debate gave birth to the field of software engineering as we know it today. The project forced the Pentagon to invest in ADA, programming language, a highly secure, standardized language for military systems. Packet switching, refining the protocols that would eventually become the backbone of the Internet. Parallel processing, the birth of supercomputers capable of running thousands of simulations at once. The narrator should spend 15 minutes explaining the math of the collision course. To hit a target moving at 7 kilometers per second, 7 dollars times 10 to 3 gas text, the computer must calculate the future position of the target with an error margin of less than a few centimeters. The trajectory is defined by slash math bf slash t x slash math beef 0 plus slash math bef t plus slash frac 1 shared math bef and t. But in space, you must also account for solar radiation pressure and the Earth's non-spherical gravity, the JK2 to Llard's effect. This massive calculation load was the silent war. The US won this war not because its lasers were better, but because its algorithms were faster. The bluff worked because the Soviets knew their computers couldn't even solve the first page of the American math. Chapter 35. Pine Gap and the Global Ear. The Australian Connection. Narrator voice, shadowy, focusing on secret bases, pacing, measured. The Star Wars project wasn't just an American endeavor, it was a global grid. To maintain 24/7 surveillance of Soviet silos, the US relied on a top-secret facility in the middle of the Australian outback, Pine Gap. Known officially as the Joint Defense Facility Pine Gap, it was and is one of the most important satellite ground stations in the world. During the SDI era, Pine Gap was the ear that listened for the electronic whispers of Soviet missile tests. The narrator should spend 12 minutes describing the isolation of Pine Gap. Thousands of miles from any major city, surrounded by red desert, American and Australian technicians sat in air-conditioned bunkers, processing the infrared data from the DSP, Defense Support Program, satellites. This global network proved that the shield wasn't just a physical barrier over the US. It was a digital net wrapped around the entire planet. The Soviets realized that they couldn't even cough in a missile silo without a computer in Australia hearing the echo. Chapter 36. The Golden Era. Faster, better, cheaper, narrator voice, transitioning, slightly cynical, focusing on the 90s, pacing, moderate. As the 80s turned into the 90s, the Star Wars budget began to shrink. NASA Administrator Dan Goldin introduced the philosophy of faster, better, cheaper. The goal was to take the complex, multi-billion-dollar SDI technologies and turn them into small, agile missions. This era saw the birth of the Pathfinder Mars rover and the first true microsatellites. The massive sensors designed to track Soviet ICBMs were shrunk down to the size of a shoebox. The technical pivot. Sensors, from heavy mirrors to solid-state CMOS chips, the ancestors of your smartphone camera. Engines, from massive liquid fuel rockets to ion thrusters that could run for years on a tiny amount of gas. The narrator should spend 15 minutes discussing how the failure to build a giant space shield led to the success of modern space exploration. We didn't get a Death Star, but we got a robotic presence on every planet in the solar system. The Star Wars project was the greatest R&D lab in history, and its byproducts are what we now call the 21st century. Chapter 37, The Ghost in the Machine, AI and the New Arms Race. Narrator voice, deep, warning, futuristic. Pacing, very slow. We are now entering the final stage of our 2-hour journey. In 2026, the Star Wars project has evolved into the AI arms race. The bluff of 1983 has become the algorithm of today. To intercept a modern Russian avant-garde hypersonic vehicle, no human can be in the loop. The decision to fire must be made by an artificial intelligence in milliseconds. The narrator should spend 20 minutes discussing the ethics of automated warfare. We are building the Skynet that Reagan's critics warned about in 1984. The SDI's legacy is a world where the speed of war has exceeded the speed of human thought. The shield is no longer made of steel or lasers, it is made of neural networks and predictive analytics. The final circle. The bluff ended the Cold War, but the technology created a new, invisible war, a war that takes place in the cloud, where the targets are no longer missiles, but the very data that runs our civilization. The Star Wars project didn't just change how we fight, it changed what we are fighting for. Chapter 38. The Grand Summary, the Billions Well Spent. Narrator voice. Grand, epic, concluding. Pacing, extremely slow with long pauses. As the 2-hour mark arrives, we reach the final verdict. Was it a bluff? Yes. Was it a waste? No. Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative stands as the ultimate example of geopolitical jiu-jitsu. He took the Soviet Union's greatest strength, their massive nuclear arsenal, and turned it into their greatest weakness. He forced them to compete in a field where they had no chance of winning. He spent billions of dollars on a dream, but that dream bought the most precious commodity on Earth: time. It bought time for the Soviet system to collapse from its own weight. It bought time for the world to move past the era of mutually assured destruction. Chapter 39. The Nervous System of the Sky, Brilliant Eyes, Narrator voice, clinical, whispering, focusing on the invisible light. Pacing, very slow and rhythmic. For a laser to fire or a brilliant pebble to strike, it first had to see. To reach our 2-hour target, we must explore the sensory layer of the SDI, a project known as Brilliant Eyes. This was a constellation of hundreds of low Earth orbit satellites equipped with cryogenically cooled infrared sensors. The challenge was immense. A Soviet ICBM in its mid-course phase is a cold object moving against the cold background of space. Detecting it is like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a dark beach from miles away. The cryogenic challenge, the sensors had to be cooled to near absolute zero, 20 bars text, IAKXOS or 253, circ, text, /RTSA, to prevent their own heat from blinding them. The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the physics of heat signatures. Every object with a temperature above absolute zero emits infrared radiation according to Planck's law. B/lambda T equal A frac 2 kHc / lambda 5 E is frac 1 EC is frac HC C is lambda T K 1. To the Soviet generals, Brilliant Eyes was the most terrifying part of the project. It meant that space was no longer a hiding place. The US wasn't just building a shield, they were building an all-seeing eye that used the very laws of thermodynamics to strip away Soviet secrecy. This chapter should feel like a journey through a frozen digital landscape where every heat bloom is a target and every cold shadow is a potential threat. Chapter 40. Cheyenne Mountain. The brain of the shield, narrator voice. Deep, echoing, resonant. Pacing. Slow, emphasizing the weight of the granite. To find the brain that would control the Star Wars project, we must go deep underground. 2,000 feet beneath the granite of the Colorado Rockies lies Cheyenne Mountain, the home of NORAD. During the 1980s, Cheyenne Mountain was transformed. It was no longer just a place to watch for incoming bombers. It was being prepared to manage a battle in orbit. The command center sat on massive springs designed to survive a multi-megaton nuclear blast. The battle management simulation, the narrator should spend 20 minutes describing the psychology of the command room. Imagine a room filled with flickering green monitors where officers practiced Star Wars simulations. They would watch as 1,000 red dots, Soviet missiles, rose from the map, and then, with a click of a button, thousands of blue dots, American interceptors, rose to meet them. These simulations were the theater of the Cold War. To the visitors from the Kremlin who were occasionally allowed to see the non-classified areas, the sheer computing power on display in Cheyenne Mountain was a message of doom. The brain was already alive, even if the arms, the lasers, were still in the lab. This chapter should emphasize the isolation and the power of the mountain. A granite skull protecting a digital mind that was planning for a war in the stars. Chapter 41. Space Mines and Blindness. The Soviet counter-defense, narrator voice, shadowy, focusing on asymmetric warfare. Pacing, measured. The Soviets were not passive observers. While they couldn't match the American lasers, they looked for the Achilles heel of the SDI, Their solution was simple, cheap, and brutal: space mines. A space mine was a small, inconspicuous satellite that would drift close to an American brilliant eye, or a laser platform. If a war began, the mine would explode, releasing a cloud of steel ball bearings. In the vacuum of space, these balls would move at several kilometers per second, shredding the delicate optics of the American sensors. The War of the Sand. The narrator should spend 15 minutes discussing the Kessler syndrome, the fear that a war in space would create so much debris that the Earth would be locked in a cage of junk for centuries. The Soviets realized they didn't have to build a shield, they just had to make space blind. This created a cat-and-mouse game in orbit. American satellites began to be equipped with their own defensive thrusters to dodge Soviet mines. Space was no longer a vacuum. It was a crowded, invisible battlefield where blindness was a weapon as potent as any laser. To the audiobook listener, this should feel like a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, played with billion-dollar machines in total silence. Chapter 42. The Cray One and the Math of a Million Girders. Narrator voice, technical, rhythmic, the sound of the machine, pacing, moderate. At the heart of the SDI was the Cray One supercomputer. With its iconic C-shaped chassis and colorful cooling benches, it was the most powerful computer in the world. To reach our 2-hour target, the narrator should provide a biography of the hardware. The Cray One could perform 160 million floating-point operations per second, 160 megaflops. While your modern smartphone is thousands of times faster, in 1983, the Cray One was a god. The finite element analysis, the SDI engineers used the Cray to simulate the structural integrity of the massive space platforms. They had to calculate how an 800-foot-long laser would react to the recoil of its own beam. This involved solving systems of linear equations with millions of variables. The narrator should explain that the Soviets had no Cray. Their best computers were years behind. This computational embargo was the true wall of the Cold War. By the time the Soviet Union managed to clone an older American chip, the US had moved on to the next generation. The Star Wars project was a race where the Americans were driving Ferraris and the Soviets were riding bicycles. The math was the sword that cut the Soviet Union in half. Chapter 43. The White Sands Failure. When the lasers went dark, narrator voice, gritty, realistic, focusing on the failure, pacing, slow. We must balance the bluff with the reality. In the New Mexico desert, at the White Sands Missile Range, the SDI project faced its most embarrassing moments. This was where the miracle, mid-infrared advanced chemical laser, lived. During one high-profile test, the laser was supposed to destroy a stationary booster on the ground. It worked. The booster exploded. But the fine print revealed a different story. The booster had been pressurized to its absolute limit, and the laser only had to tickle it to cause a failure. The dust and the beam in other tests, the beam was scattered by simple dust and moisture in the air. The scientists realized that a ground-to-space laser was almost impossible because the atmosphere acts like a distorted lens. The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the frustration of the scientists. They were being pushed by the White House to produce results for the evening news while the physics were saying no. This tension between the political dream and the physical reality is the core of the Hindenburg-like fragility of the SDI. It was a giant made of light, but it could be defeated by a cloud. Chapter 44, The Media Theater, Selling the Shield to the Public. Narrator voice, observational, slightly witty, focusing on the spin. Pacing, measured and slow. The battle for Star Wars wasn't just fought in laboratories or the Kremlin, it was fought on the 6:30 p.m. evening news. To reach our 2-hour mark, we must analyze how the American media inadvertently became a central player in the Great Bluff. When the press first dubbed the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars, they meant it as a mockery. They wanted to paint Reagan as a delusional actor living in a fantasy world. But in one of the greatest marketing pivots in political history, the administration embraced the name. They realized that Star Wars sounded like the future, and the future belonged to America. The newsreel, War Every Night, networks like ABC, CBS, and NBC showed colorful animations of lasers zapping Soviet missiles. These graphics were simplistic, but they were convincing. To a citizen in Iowa or a KGB agent in East Berlin, these animations didn't look like concepts. On a television screen, they looked like capabilities. The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the psychological impact of the visualization. If people see a video of a laser working, they believe it exists. The US government fed the media a steady diet of test footage and artists' renderings. This created a feedback loop. The media reported on the imminent shield, which scared the Soviets, who then protested, which the media reported as proof that the Soviets were scared of something real. The bluff was being sustained by the very people who were trying to debunk it. Chapter 45. ASAT. The sword in the F-15's claw. Narrator. Voice. High energy, technical, focusing on the kinetic strike. Pacing. Moderate. While the lasers were still mostly theoretical, the US decided to show the world that it could already kill satellites with conventional weapons. This was the ASM-135 ASAT anti-satellite missile. In September 1985, a highly modified F-15 Eagle took off from Vandenberg Air Force Base. It didn't go to space, it just flew very high and very fast. At the edge of the atmosphere, the pilot pulled into a vertical climb and released a missile. That missile didn't have an explosive warhead. It had a kinetic kill vehicle that used a miniature infrared seeker to find a dying American satellite, the P-78-1. The physics of the impact. The intercept occurred at an altitude of 525 text km/h, 326 bars text miles/hour. The closing speed was approximately 24,000 bar text per km cars, 15,000 bar text hours an hour. The kinetic energy kilodolars of the impact can be expressed by kx frac 1 beer samosi evx2. Even a small mass on im del soil becomes a weapon of mass destruction at that velocity. Belspalers. The satellite didn't just break, it turned into a cloud of 10,000 pieces of shrapnel. The narrator should spend 20 minutes describing the Soviet reaction to the ASAT test. This wasn't a bluff. This was a physical demonstration that the US could blind the Soviet Union in the first 5 minutes of a war. If the US could hit a tiny satellite with a missile launched from a fighter jet, the Soviets had to assume they could hit an ICBM. The ASAT test was the proof of concept that made the rest of the Star Wars bluff believable. Chapter 46, Project Timberwind, the atomic heart of space travel. Narrator voice. Deep, warning, focusing on the forbidden tech. Pacing, very slow. To make the SDI work, you needed power, massive amounts of it. Batteries weren't enough. Solar panels were too fragile. The answer was a secret, controversial project known as Timberwind. Timberwind aimed to create a nuclear thermal rocket, NTR. Instead of burning chemical fuel, the rocket would use a compact nuclear reactor to heat liquid hydrogen to extreme temperatures, blasting it out of a nozzle to create thrust. The nuclear gamble. The narrator should spend 15 minutes discussing the danger and the genius of Timberwind. A nuclear rocket is twice as efficient as a chemical one. It would have allowed the US to launch massive laser platforms into high orbits that the Soviets couldn't reach. However, the idea of launching dozens of nuclear reactors into space was a public relations nightmare. If a rocket exploded on the launch pad, it would create a dirty bomb over Florida. Timberwind remained one of the blackest of the black projects. The Soviets heard rumors of it and realized that the Americans were willing to break every taboo of the nuclear age to win the high ground. The Star Wars project wasn't just a tech race, it was becoming a total war of physics, where the US was willing to put reactors in the sky to protect its soil on the ground. Chapter 47. The Neutral Gateways. Smuggling. Silicon, narrator voice. Shadowy, investigative, focusing on the supply chain war. Pacing, steady. The Soviet Union couldn't build the computers for SDI because they couldn't get the chips. The US had established COCOM, Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, to prevent any high tech from reaching the Iron Curtain. But the Soviets were desperate. To reach our 2-hour mark, the narrator should spend 15 minutes on the smuggling routes through Sweden, Switzerland, and Japan. This was the Silicon Underground. Soviet agents would set up shell companies in neutral countries to buy American high-end workstations, ostensibly for medical research or weather tracking, and then ship them to Moscow in crates marked radios or calculators. The Toshiba-Kongsberg scandal, one of the most famous leaks, involved milling machines that allowed the Soviets to build much quieter submarine propellers. While not directly SDI-related, it proved to the Reagan administration that the tech wall was porous. In response, the US tightened the screws even further. The Star Wars project became the excuse to launch a global tech embargo. If a piece of technology might be used for SDI research, it was banned. This didn't just hurt the Soviet military, it strangled the Soviet civilian economy, preventing them from entering the personal computer revolution that was currently making the West wealthy. The bluff wasn't just about what America had, it was about what America refused to let the Soviets have. Chapter 48, The Psychology of the Silo. The human at the end of the laser, narrator voice. Empathetic, somber, focusing on the man with the key. Pacing, very slow. We have talked about satellites, math, and lasers, but as we head toward the finale of this 2-hour production, we must remember the human beings living in the silos. During the 1980s, the tension was so high that many missile officers, both American and Soviet, suffered from extreme psychological stress. They were the ones who would have to turn the keys if the shield failed. The two-man rule and the weight of the world, the narrator should spend 20 minutes describing the life in a Minuteman III silo. The silence, the 24-hour shifts, and the red phone that was never supposed to ring. The Star Wars project actually increased the pressure on these men. If the shield worked, their role was redundant. If it didn't, they were the last line of defense. For the Soviet officers, the fear was even worse. They were told the American Star Wars would allow the US to strike without warning. This led to a hair-trigger mentality where the window for human decision-making was shrinking towards zero. This chapter should be a meditation on the fragility of peace, a peace that was being held together by the sanity of a few hundred men in concrete rooms, while the Star Wars played out in the stars above them. The Star Wars Gambit. The final chapters. Chapter 49. The Walk in the Woods. The Diplomacy of the Abyss. Narrator voice, intimate, quiet, focusing on the human connection. Pacing, very slow and reflective. As we reach the endgame of the 1980s, we must step away from the glowing monitors of Cheyenne Mountain and look at two men walking through the snow. This was the human shield that truly protected the world. While the Strategic Defense Initiative was a technological sword of Damocles, it forced a level of diplomatic intimacy that the world had never seen. Reagan and Gorbachev weren't just negotiating over warheads, they were negotiating over the fear that the SDI had created. The Reykjavik paradox. In that small house in Iceland, the world almost changed forever. Reagan offered to share the technology. Gorbachev refused to believe him. But in that friction, something else happened. They stopped seeing each other as ideological monoliths and began seeing each other as two men trying to avoid a mistake that would end the world. The narrator should spend 15 minutes describing the emotional exhaustion of the final summits. The SDI was the ghost in the room. It was the thing Reagan wouldn't give up, and the thing Gorbachev couldn't overcome. In the end, it was this very stalemate that forced them to talk about the zero option, the total elimination of intermediate-range missiles. The bluff didn't just win the war, it forced the peace by making the alternative too expensive and too unpredictable to survive. Chapter 50. The Great Brain Drain, the Aftermath of a Mirage. Narrator voice, gritty, investigative, focusing on the human spoils of war. Pacing, steady. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, the Star Wars project achieved its final quiet victory. But a new problem emerged. What happens to the thousands of Soviet scientists who spent their lives trying to build lasers to kill American satellites, the migration of the laser masters? This was the scientific exodus. Fearing that these experts would sell their knowledge to rogue states, the United States launched programs to hire them. The very men who had been the enemy in the 1980s were now working in American universities and laboratories. The narrator should spend 12 minutes detailing the irony of history. The research the Soviets had done to counter the bluff was actually quite advanced in some areas, specifically in high-energy physics and plasma propulsion. By 1995, the Star Wars project had successfully absorbed its own opposition. The bluff had not only broken the Soviet system, it had invited its most brilliant minds to help build the American future. Chapter 51, 2026, The Resurrection of the Shield. Narrator voice, authoritative, modern, looking toward the horizon. Pacing, slow and ominous. We stand now in the year 2026. The world looks different, yet the shadows of 1983 are longer than ever. The Star Wars project has been rebranded, reborn and rearmed. We no longer talk about brilliant pebbles, but about autonomous orbital interceptors. The AI shield, today's missile defense, isn't a bluff. It's a necessity. With the rise of hypersonic missiles that can maneuver at Mach 10, the human in the loop is gone. We have built the Skynet that 1980s activists feared. A global AI-driven grid that monitors every launch in real time. The narrator should spend 20 minutes discussing the legacy of the bluff. Every GPS satellite, every stealth aircraft, and every high-speed processor in your home is a child of the SDI budget. Reagan didn't build a shield of lasers, he built the infrastructure of the information age. We won the Cold War because we chose to build computers while they chose to build concrete. Chapter 52. The Final Verdict. Did the lie save the world? Narrator voice, grand, epic, concluding. Pacing, extremely slow, with 5-second pauses between paragraphs. As the 2-hour mark arrives, we must render a verdict. Was the Strategic Defense Initiative a lie? Yes. Was it a trillion-dollar waste of resources? Perhaps. But was it the most successful act of nonviolent warfare in human history? Indisputably, Ronald Reagan understood something his critics did not. He understood that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger held together by the myth of its own strength. By challenging that strength with a space shield, he forced the tiger to reveal its hollow interior. The last word, the Cold War, ended without a nuclear winter. It ended with a whimper, not a bang. It ended because a Hollywood actor told a story so convincing, so technologically daring, that the evil empire simply lost the will to compete. The Star Wars gambit remains the ultimate proof that in the theater of geopolitics, imagination is the most powerful weapon in the arsenal. The lasers may have been fake, but the peace they bought was real.